and gentlemen, it's an honour. It's an honour to be here today with you. Professor Hattam and I are currently polishing the data that we're working for from a $500,000 research project from the Australian Research Council that is theorising a culturally responsive pedagogy. We're working with 7 schools in the north, and so it's a real honour today to talk to you and bring you some of the findings, but also some of the theoretical concepts that we're working with. We want to start by this cartoon, and Peanuts is always an interesting cartoon. I wonder what teachers make. And lots of our society talk about this, and lots of people don't know what we do. And when we use the term pedagogy, it's very poorly understood, sometimes even by our own disciplines. But a difference, peppermint patty, they make a difference. And that's what we're about today. We're about the issue of what is it about teachers' pedagogy that makes a difference to community, to the lives of children who bring strong diversity to our schools. Okay, so we're going to move through toward a decolonising Australian culturally responsive pedagogy. We acknowledge that we're on Guyana country and it's a beautiful country. Okay, so our main moves that we're looking at today is we want to introduce the 2 rationales, the 2 provocations. We want to look at our focus and give you some idea about some techniques about redesigning pedagogy and curriculum. We want to share with you the version of culturally responsive pedagogy. We are in the midst of publishing our literature review, which would be the most comprehensive literature review in the world on culturally responsive pedagogy and how it relates to Australia. So you'll be more than welcome to have access to that once we publish it. We'll look at some works in progress, and then we'll try and finish off with the decolonising framework. So, without further ado, my section is to try and work through. Rob and I will be swapping over throughout the project, but I'm going to try and talk you through the provocations. There's 2 provocations this morning, and I just wanted to start with the lack of diverse teacher pedagogy being offered in Australia to an increasingly diverse student population is ultimately the catalyst for our research. This notion that what are the teacher pedagogies you go to when Australia is becoming super diverse? Which ones do you go to? The literature basically suggests that Australian teachers generally have around about 4 or 5 pedagogies, go-to pedagogies that they, in any issues or any challenges, that's the ones that they go to. And they, when they find a challenging situation, it's, they try and use these 6, and even though some of them don't fit, they're very reluctant to adopt new ones. We know in Australia that the last decade in Australian history, despite our attempts, has not produced the educational results that policymakers, educators and parents would have hoped for, particularly concerning the education of students from culturally diverse backgrounds. So the case for change. Our project is to examine how teachers enact culturally responsive pedagogy in Australian mainstream middle schools. And why is this important for Aboriginal education or for Islamic studies? Is because most Aboriginal children and most Muslim children are in public schools. They're taught by a workforce, a teacher education workforce that's mainly middle class, non-Indigenous. And that's what makes this project so important. We are working with 7 mainstream public schools. We believe that public schools are the engine room for democracy, and that all children that attend a public school should have their democratic rights met. So there are 5 particular things that we're mining for in this extensive research that we're working on. We're wanting to establish a research community across a cluster of schools, a professional development network on culturally responsive pedagogy. And we want to see how teachers, we want to test and see how teachers work with these. We want to obviously review the literature. We're going to publish that soon. We want to analyse the policy. What are the supportive and inhibitive factors in Australian policy that make cultural responsive pedagogies rise? We're looking at it. We use an action research model. We'll tell you a little bit about that. And we want to advance the descriptions and theorisations. And we hope that this work will bring you some clarity of where the edge is in the field. So let's then begin with the two provocations. Well, firstly, Australia is an increasingly culturally diverse country. And there is good evidence that cultural diversity does contribute to our economy and our society. And Australia makes claims about high levels of community harmony and social cohesion. However, you have the Racial Discrimination Act being argued for change, and you have Tin Sukudaxon arguing, I'm not racist, but 40 years of Racial Discrimination Act. There are challenges afield with diversity in Australia. So we're asking in these challenging times, what pedagogies work inside schools with teachers that work with high diversity? Barely half the population of parents born in Australia to Australian born parents. So the census says that 49% of the population are either first or second generation migrants. If you have a look here, Australia is becoming more culturally diverse than what it ever was. And 1 in 5 Australians, despite this, 1 in 5 Australians have experienced race hate talk. 86% of Australians support and want to tackle racism. Given that 1 in 2 parents, 1 in 2 people in Australians have an overseas born parent, or 1 in 4 Australians were born overseas. So we're becoming super diverse. How does teacher pedagogy address this? So even though global nations such as Australia are contending with serious tensions around cultural diversity, there are a whole range of nations around the world that are dealing with high ranges of human geography that's moving across the world. And inside the nation, traditional sites such as societies and communities are breaking down. Family, church, local community. But then new formations of sociality and community are evident, such as trends towards hyper-nationalism and religious fundamentalism of various kinds. So whilst we might be rightly proud of multiculturalism in Australia, then cultural diversity is still a highly contested type of concept, both in the workplace, in the media, and in culture, the modern Australian culture. And cultural diversity is one of the most divisive sites in Australian politics at the moment. So what does this mean for culturally responsive pedagogies? We all know the famous aspects about Pauline Hanson. We all know the Cronulla riots. These are the barometers by which we measure issues of multiculturalism in Australia. We've got Alan Jones, who on air after losing appeal over the Cronulla riots case, I don't want to spend more time on that. Nigel Farage, anti-migrant posters, pointing to show that we're at breaking point. We have the alternative right coming in and suggesting that multiculturalism is enemy. And we've got to stop the hordes, we've got to keep out those from coming here. We also have Australia Day, whereby those who have come later determine who now comes to those shores of Australia. In terms of Indigenous Australians, every Australia Day, whose histories are valid, always comes up. So there are these various critiques of multiculturalism in Australia in that diversity is somehow challenged. Aboriginal stories of the apology to Aboriginal peoples. the need for a treaty and the recognition of Aboriginal peoples need to be put into the Constitution. The birth certificate of Australia doesn't recognise half of the family, and so it's silent on Aboriginal people. And yet Aboriginal peoples have been here for 65,000 years. There is no treaty. We're the only country in the world that doesn't have a treaty with its Indigenous peoples. And despite callings for it, they're still falling on deaf ears. So we want to know that, importantly, through schools are affected by this, and teachers are affected by these issues. So despite some of the schools in Australia, in South Australia, having no less than 40 different multicultural groups, so how does a teacher deal with this? We also, the second provocation, not only are we talking about multicultural groups, we're also talking about Indigenous education. And we can scroll through these, but generally when an Indigenous child starts at early childhood, it is also working at the same sorts of levels as non-Indigenous children. Once the child gets to grade 7, the educational outcome is bounced out to 30% below. And so there's something seriously wrong with a situation where a child can start equal to everybody else, and then by the time they get to grade 7, that the educational outcome gap is up to 30%. So, Indigenous Australians, our focus is on redesigning curriculum and pedagogy that answers these two provocations: a highly diverse Australia and the issue of Aboriginal education is in crisis.
So, just to summarise Irabinna's two provocations, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, some of us were at the University of South Australia working under the trope of learning to live in culturally diverse societies, and Irabinna's gone through some sort of rationale around we now find ourselves in super diverse Australia. As one of the slides, one of the schools quite close to here has 75 nationalities. Most of the schools we work in the northern suburbs have at least 35 or 45. So we're not talking about something that's coming. It's a reality for most teachers in Adelaide, and walking into classrooms with super diverse populations. And I suppose in this case, from our side, moving across to our other provocation. The project that we're reporting on was highlighting the first of the provocations, i.e. our concern around appalling learning outcomes for Indigenous kids. And as Irabinna points out, most Indigenous families live in large cities or large regional towns in Australia, and hence sending their children to the local school. So the schools we work in might have 2 or 3 Indigenous kids in each class, but then there's 15 other nationalities as well. And I guess for this conference, some of those kids are Islamic. So that's what's going on for young people, and that's the challenge for teachers. So it appears to us, of course, that the most important thing for us all to be talking about is curriculum and pedagogy. We were so pleased when the conference was framed up around pedagogy. So we just want to move over into talking about how we understand those things. The project that we're reporting on today uses an action research approach to work with teachers on curriculum and pedagogy. So right from the get-go, we're quite committed to engaging in sort of collegiate collaborations with teachers around what we should be doing around improving curriculum and pedagogy. And whilst we might have some good ideas, it appears to us to be quite clear that if we are going to be making a difference, it's in collaboration with teachers that the good ideas are going to actually be enacted. And so we're sort of avoiding coming into places and telling people what they should be doing. We're much more interested in engaging in dialogue with teachers about how we might be moving forward, in which case we think that the action research approach is sort of ideal. And our approach has one cycle over a year. We ask teachers to think about one unit of work that they're going to teach in the 3rd term and redesign that. You can see term 3. We spend the first half of the year trying to support teachers to redesign something and then work out how they might systematically research it. Let's call that action research. If we had more time, we could go into that. But if you're interested in our approach, then please email us, and we've got thousands of PowerPoint presentations and so forth about how you might run action research in a school if you're committed to that sort of collaboration. So our approach has this set of ideas fundamentally. I think everyone's clear that the teacher is the key actor. That's the thing we have to be focusing on. But what teachers do in classrooms is curriculum and pedagogy. That defines their work. So that's got to be the thing that we have to be spending time on. Again, if we're committed to that, then we have to be able to sustain professional learning communities for and with teachers. We have to be taking seriously the challenges that teachers have. Again, as far as we can see, when we go looking around the country at the types of professional learning that's on offer for teachers, what they find themselves having to put up with, basically, is mostly school leadership telling them that they need to be implementing policy. Very, very few opportunities do teachers have in their schools to be raising the concerns they've got from the classroom, and that being the thing that drives professional learning. So again, action research for us starts with teachers naming their classroom challenges and then working from there, rather than you need to be a good teacher and do what we tell you to do. We can't see how that's going to work, actually. Well, it's not, is it? All the numbers around Australian schooling are all sort of collapsing because we've had 15 years of these policies where governments are telling teachers what they should be doing without listening to what teachers are actually saying are the challenges driving from the classroom. One of the things, of course, that's very important in this space, too many schools suffer from deficit views of the young people that they serve. We can't see how we can be moving forward on a sort of justice project unless we can be unsettling deficit views of young people. That seems to be sort of fundamental. And again, the sort of direction that we're moving in, we need to be treating the life worlds of young people seriously in a curriculum and pedagogical sense. We need to be engaging in conversations with what they bring to school rather than just doing them with our knowledge. So some sort of dialogue between what we think is important and what the student brings. I think that's fairly straightforward. And again, it appears to us as though in early childhood teachers always do that. And then as you move away from early childhood, we forget. And we forget that we've got to start with what the sort of children bring to class. And of course, our final point here is one of the things we notice, again, the sort of policy framework that teachers are now working in are forcing them into more sort of highly scripted, ritualised forms of teaching, which as far as we can see are completely going in the wrong direction. So our project's again trying to move away from supporting highly scripted forms of pedagogy to ones that are much more improvisational, if we can use that terminology. So a few definitions here. We quite like this one. I think it probably pegs what some of the previous speakers were saying. Pedagogy here refers to a deliberate attempt to influence how and what knowledge and identities are produced with and among particular sets of social relations. So in this case, the definition is focusing on knowledge and identity. Okay, so there's a transaction around knowledge and identity formation. So what types of young people do we want to be producing seems to be a fundamental question. And what's the mediation of knowledge? How do we understand that? I suppose, again, to make the basic point, we've got some quotes here. Scholars in South Australia are often draw on a guy called Garth Boomer, who was the curriculum director in South Australia in the 1970s and 80s. And probably we are both here because of him. Anyway, one of his famous quotes, "Unless we solve the pedagogy problem, all other efforts at reconstruction will be in vain." We think that's fairly straightforward, actually. And a more recent version of that from Bob Lingard, a famous educational sociologist in Australia. It's through pedagogies that education gets done. I think it just sort of really brings the focus to our conversation. Probably the Lingard quote's the trope for this conference. we're mentioning the whole notion around sustaining professional learning communities here. Again, I think I briefly had a go at criticising the sort of modalities of professional learning that are on offer, that tend to be revolving around just implementing the right answer, as opposed to starting with the challenges that teachers have in classrooms. And here's a quote from our friend Deb Hayes. The key issue is not what kinds of pedagogies improve outcomes, but how to support the development of the kinds of pedagogies that we have good reason to believe will work. As in the past, the sticking point remains practice. So when I have a look at the sort of dominant modality of professional learning, it goes something like this. You're in the room, I'm giving you the right answer on Friday, and then on Monday you're doing it. That's the sort of logic I think that teachers are now working in. Meantime, of course, what we're talking about is quite complicated practices, and somehow or other teachers are supposed to work out how to change their practice between Saturday and Sunday, as opposed to having some much more elongated learning process in which they're more in control, and we've got some serious collaborations with colleagues about what that practice is. We can't see how implementing the right answer is ever going to be going to work in this context. How am I going? When we're talking about the sort of professional challenges of teachers, when we go talking to teachers, they talk to us about things like this. So, how do I sustain positive relationships and expect the kids to do hard things? That's the way that teachers talk to us about their sort of challenges. So, in the schools that we work in, it almost seems like there's an inverse relationship between the two, actually. As soon as I get the kids to do hard things, my relationships collapse, and therefore I go back to doing, giving them easier things. How do I unsettle deficit views of students? How do I treat student life well seriously? These are the sort of questions that teachers we work with raise. Maybe here's a way of defining the problem. The challenge here is to provide learning experiences that are intellectually demanding, along with appropriate pedagogy that supports students to be successful. I think one of the things that our profession's now got is a massive confusion around the key concepts. First of all, the concept of pedagogy is radically under-theorised, and we've got the word curriculum as well that we're trying to use, and again, massive confusion around how those concepts are actually understood. So, I don't know how you're going with your reading. I've been in the field for about 40 years, and during that period I've watched the rise of what's called curriculum studies. And again, if you're a student of education theory, you'll realise that curriculum studies is only about 40 or 50 years old. It's a very, very small subfield in education. During that time, the concept of curriculum was expanded from the old definition, the intended curriculum. The symbol then means everything, and probably the definition just expands so much that it sort of loses its meaning. Meantime, in the last 20 years, there's been the rise of people that are interested in the concept of pedagogy, and again, this is complicated, again, radically under-theorised. Pedagogy, for me, invokes two different things. On the one hand, it's a word that invokes a whole lot of debates around politics and technology and so forth and so on, but that doesn't help us work out what we're going to do in classrooms sometimes, in which case another definition of pedagogy is practice. So for me, the two terms we're using here, the expansive definition of curriculum includes pedagogy. It's sort of a subset. Again, this is confusing, but if we go back to the narrow definition of curriculum, what do we intend to do? I think there's sort of two challenges for all of us in the room. First of all, the curriculum work we need to do is how do we set young people challenging and hard things to do? This does seem to be a key challenge for our country. And once we've set them hard things to do, what do we do in the class, in real time, that enables them all to be successful? So we've got a curriculum challenge and a pedagogical one that need to be sort of solved simultaneously. And if we're getting past highly scripted forms of teaching, huge amount of possibilities here, and I've been trying to collect up all the various options that one can think through here. So in curriculum studies, there's negotiating the curriculum. In Australia, the Queensland colleagues developed the productive pedagogies. They have this notion of connectedness. There's the funds of knowledge approach from Texas. There's people talking about local literacies. Again, there's many variations on a theme here, and we probably should put Islamic pedagogy here as well. Just in terms of our basic definition, though, hopefully this will have some resonance. Whenever we talk to teachers and say, what's your pedagogy? And you've got to get past the jargon because unfortunately the profession doesn't even use the term, but they say to us, it's about relationships. And this is very, very straightforward to all of us when we think about our teaching. It's about relationships. But of course, it's not just about any old relationship, it's something quite specific, in which case for me, and maybe before we move to the next slide, I think the trope, it's about relationships, is both banal and profound. So I think we need to be moving towards thinking about how profound that is actually. And that, for me, this is the space we need to be doing the work, because I think if we're trying to improve learning outcomes for young people through pedagogy, then we have to change the nature of the relationships. That seems to me to be fundamental. So anyway, it's an educated relationship, in which case, to quote from Lusted, it's a transaction between students, teacher, knowledge and identity. It's not the relationship you've got with your uncle or your sister. It's an educated relationship, in which case there's a transaction around knowledge, and one could also add identity, which I think connects with sort of previous themes. We could add action there as well. It's a relationship between students, teacher, knowledge, identity and action. We've added more recently. But again, if we go back to, we've got this mediation between the knowledge of the students and the teachers. Unfortunately, I think we still live in a time when transmission pedagogies are the dominant variety, in which case the teacher's doing it to the students, and what the students bring isn't really on the table. Okay? But if we're more, if we're moving towards more dialogic forms of pedagogy, then how do we understand what the students bring to the transaction? And again, I've been trying to locate some various places that we could go in the education literature around that. And if you want to, we could spend days outlining all the sort of various options, funds of knowledge, place, etc., etc. So again, trying to work up some vocabulary that enables us to think about what do the young people bring to the transaction, and trying to work with that. Again, I think we've got culturally responsive teaching here. We could have the dot point sort of Islamic pedagogy. Maybe I think if you've been reading in this area, you will have come across the work of Lisa Delpit, an African-American scholar. I think she wrote a beautiful book called Educating Other People's Children. In a sort of a summarised version of that paper, this is the way she frames up the problem. I suggest that students must be taught the codes needed to participate fully in the mainstream of life, the codes being powerful knowledge, powerful literacies that schools are responsible for, not by being forced to attend to hollow, inane, decontextualised sub-skills, but rather within the context of meaningful communicative endeavours, that they must be allowed the resource of a teacher's expert knowledge while being helped to acknowledge their own expertnesses as well. Oh, we've only got 5 minutes. If I've gone on and on and on, I think I have. Do you want to zoom on to the next bit? Surely that hasn't happened.
No, it hasn't. So in essence, culturally responsive pedagogy is constructed. There are a whole range of theories that in the past have really sort of assisted us. The notion of Reggio Emilia, Rinaldi's work, Melody Vygotsky's children, child-centered learning, and Louis Moll and so on. So the cultural responsive pedagogy doesn't just emerge, it comes through theories. So what are some of the theories around difference that you go to look at cultural response to pedagogy? Well, Ladston and Billings were writing about African American children in Australia, in the United States, and she says that her version of cultural responsive pedagogy rests on 3 criteria. Student must experience academic success, they must maintain their cultural competence from their communities, but also be understanding other children's cultures and knowledges and values and difference. And that the student must have some sort of critical consciousness. In terms of First Nation Native American children, Villegas and Lucas were writing that the problem is increasing, increasing diversity inside your classroom has to focus, the teacher has to have these characteristics: social, cultural, conscious, affirming the views that the students bring. So focusing on the things that the child brings, not what they don't bring to school, and use that as the foundation for learning. Is capable of promoting learners' knowledge, knows about the lives of the students that's in the classroom, and uses his or her teacher's knowledge about the students' lives to design instruction. We say if you're a teacher in our project, we say the child as competent subject, the child as a knowledge holder from generations of family members. And it's not the child as a dangerous subject, which is being constructed at the moment by some nations around the world, is constructing the child as a dangerous subject. The child is a competent subject, and the teacher is a competent teacher, and the public school system is where democracy is enacted. It's the champion of democracy. So, I'll hand that to you.
Yeah, well, we've just... Irabinna gave the short version of the sort of 2 provocations that we sort of developed to come up with our project. And meantime, of course, we're living in a settler colonial country, and the colonial project's still ongoing. And so it's quite clear to us in the last year or so that we really need to be doing a lot more sort of intellectual work around thinking about decolonisation as sort of a key logic of our project. And just to sort of make the point here, here's the colonial map of Australia, which we're all familiar with. Here's the Indigenous one. This map's been around for a long time. When we go out into schools, young people have never even seen this map. They've only ever seen this one. So there's multiple maps, aren't there? So which maps are being used becomes important. So, or there's this one, the sort of map of languages in the country. This one's relatively new. That's another way of thinking about what's going on. Again, if you're thinking about living in a sort of a country with a colonial history, one needs to be careful around how we sort of understand the sort of colonial project. And it's quite clear to us that Australia's understood to be a settler colonial country, and you can have a look at the sort of Pacific Rim, New Zealand, Australia, South America, North America, Canada. Okay, those countries were all colonised by the British, and so they've got the classic settler colonial histories. And when you go looking for some powerful definitions of what it means to live in a settler colonial country, this one seems to be one that I'm thinking sort of accurate. Settler colonialism predominantly bypasses Indigenous people in an attempt to directly connect with the land. The aim's not exploitation, but a winner-take or replacement. The aim of settler or internal nationalism is either the obliteration or complete assimilation of Indigenous peoples inside the grid of the nation state. And clearly the sort of debate that's going on in our country, many people are trying to tell us that the colonial period was some time ago, and we've sort of passed that and we're in some sort of post-colonial utopia. It seems clear to us that that, of course, is completely inaccurate, and we're still living in a country where there's a serious settler colonial mentality that's sort of in play, and one only just needs to be paying a small amount of attention in the way that our governments treat Indigenous people's demands for treaty to see how this is sort of being played out. And we can go on and on and on with all the sort of various dot points. I think we talked about Orientalism. I think there's a type of Orientalism that's in play in the Australian context, and some people call it Aboriginalism. So Hodge and Mishra invoke this concept, and again, invoking CITE, they must therefore be represented by others. Apparently, Indigenous people can't represent themselves, and so the more powerful get to represent the minority, and most people in this room understand how that plays. I suppose in Australia, the way that we can salve our conscience is we can claim that we live in a sort of tolerant liberal multiculturalism, but again for me, liberal multiculturalism, according to Wendy Brown and Elizabeth Povinelli, argues tolerance for cultural diversity, and we hear those discourses whilst containing it at the same time. Put simply, these other cultures are fine, but we must be able to locate them within our own grid. So you can see the sort of, the way the sort of clever argument goes. There's a sort of a tolerance, but tolerance is probably a bit of a scam, really. And again, we could go on and on and on about the problems around intolerant, really, liberal multiculturalism, but we're no longer really living in a liberal society, we're now living in a neoliberal one, in which case we've now got neoliberal multiculturalism, which is its own thing. And people were mentioning neoliberalism, and again, we could spend hours and hours and hours sort of unpacking on neoliberalism, which we probably should. And again, this is sort of affecting us all. Whenever I'm listening to the public debate around the others in our country, I'm sort of a white fella really, this is interesting for me, but anyway, I hear these things. We're claiming we. There's a lot of people claiming we, but really they're claiming it in the name of the privileged already. There's an attempt to narrow our concern for the suffering of others. That's constantly on the go. There's a dehumanising of others that's sort of part of the public debate. There's the politics of reiteration. So the other side just keeps on saying their thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over until it becomes true. And we suffer amnesia. We just can't remember. We refuse to remember. We undermine social movement struggles through derision. There's a rigid binary, and we can see this quite often. You're either with us or against us, etc. Some people claim religion as a rationale for their own prejudice, and we can see that around various things in the public space. There's many people playing post-truth, just being free with the truth, really. But then, when you have a look at them, they're desperately trying to control the politics of their own representation, which I think is sort of novel. And of course, the thing that's really on the go is there's people invoking negative emotions, mainly fear and anger, which sort of confuse the whole thing radically. So this seems to be the public space we're working in. Young people are living in that space and they come to school. So what's our responsibility when all this is in play? We can't avoid this. Young people in grade 3 and grade 4 come from homes out of this space. So that seems to be our responsibility. Again, we're sort of still struggling to get on top of this, but anyway, we'll put that out for this conference. So thank you very much.